Well, tonight we are going to look at Bible archaeology and its proof or its witness of the proof of the Bible and the stories that it presents. Tonight we're going to be looking at this archaeology through the eyes of real people that were alive before and at the time of and after the time of the Lord Jesus Christ. And this, of all of those times, there is one man that stands in the background of all of that. In fact, the whole of the New Testament, a silent man in the background, who is this man here, which is Herod the Great. Herod the Great is everywhere throughout the lives of Jesus, John the Baptist, the disciples, the apostles, and the Apostle Paul. Everywhere those people go, he's there in some form. Herod was a man that was instrumental to the whole world that they lived in and that they walked in. And he created much of that literal world at that they were living upon. And yet, ironically, this man is very little in the Scripture as a man himself. Herod the Great only appears in Luke chapter 1 and verse 5, and here in this reading that we've just had this evening up until verse 19. The rest of his life is very much chronicled in the works of Josephus, and if you want to have a good look at somebody's terrible life, well then a good read of Josephus will present this man in all his badness. He was so that's the whole world that Jesus, the Apostle Paul, and all of those in the New Testament revolved around things that were produced by him. He was an Idumean by ancestry, which means that he was of Edomite origin, a place south of Judea. And after the death of Julius Caesar in Rome, Herod was appointed king of the Jews. And he became so in 37 BC. And it took him a little while to ascend to the throne, 3 years in fact, because it wasn't until he helped with victories of Rome over Jerusalem, the capture of Jerusalem, that he actually ascended to that title of King of the Jews. But he was a megalomaniac and a very narcissistic person. And like all of those types of people, Herod the Great was both a great man, as he was known, but also one of the worst people that you'd really want to know intimately. He was completely about power, his own power, and his own image to both the Jewish people and to the Roman people that controlled Israel at the time. And most of his descendants were not much better than he. So Herod the Great, as he was known, was described as a madman who murdered his own family and a great many rabbis, the evil genius of the Judean nation. He was prepared to commit any crime in order to gratify his unbounded ambitions, and the greatest builder in Jewish history. So that's a fairly good portfolio. And so he was feared by his 10 wives, which are listed down the side there. He had 10 wives, he had 14 children, perhaps more, and he was feared by them all. And upon this scene, we've had the little story here of the birth of Christ. So welcome the Son of God into the world of Herod the Great. And so as Ben read for us, in verse 1 it says, "Now when Jesus was born, and the time was about 4 BC, in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king," that's Herod the Great. So there he is there mentioned. "And the wise men came, the Magi came from the east to Jerusalem." Verse 2, saying, "Where is he that is born King of the Jews? Now, to a man who was king of the Jews, those words weren't very nice words to hear, especially to a man who was all about power. And so they say, "For we have seen his star in the east and are come to worship him." So this king of the Jews is very concerned about that. And if we jump down to verse 7, "So Herod the Great, when he had privily called the wise men, inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, Go and search diligently for the young child, and when you have found him, bring me word again, that I may come there too and worship him." He was a great liar as well. Verse 13, "And when they were departed, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, Arise, and take the young child and his mother, and flee into Egypt, and be thou there until I bring thee word, for Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. And he arose, and he took the young child and his mother by night, and departed into Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled that was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, Out of Egypt have I called my son. Then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, was exceedingly wroth, and sent forth and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem and in all the coasts thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently acquired of the wise men." So this is the man. Joseph had taken Jesus and Mary down to Egypt to flee from the wrath of Herod. And while that was happening, Herod's wrath was against all the young children, 2 years old and under, and he killed them all. Now, there's possibly doesn't affect as many as perhaps it sounds. It probably only affected, it's reported perhaps about 20 children, because in those days towns such as Bethlehem were not very hugely populated. So the effect may not have been as big as perhaps what we first think. But 20 children is 20 children, and it's a terrible thing. And that's the kind of man that he was. But not only that, he had killed 3 of his own children. He had killed 2 of his own grandchildren. He killed his brother, 2 of his brother-in-laws, and his favourite wife. And all of them because they somehow threatened the power that he had and his ascendancy to the throne. So that was the man that was around at the time of the birth of the Lord. And then verse 19 says, "But when Herod was dead, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt." So he's now dead and he's gone. So that's why in Scripture he only appears for such a short little while. And it's only perhaps a year or 2 that he's there as far as the New Testament is concerned. But on his deathbed, he made plans to have the most prominent members of every Jewish family executed at the moment of his death. And that was to ensure that the passing of himself would be accompanied with sufficient mourning. This was later called the slaughter of the innocents at Bethlehem, and it was entirely in keeping with Herod's character. And so he died not long after the birth of the Lord, sometime around about 4 BC, perhaps a little later. And after him, his throne was broken into 4 parts. And if you get confused by the Herods that appear, there's little wonder, because there were many of them, and their lives are a complete mess. And there are at least 6 Herods mentioned in the Bible, in the New Testament. Their family tree was a shocker, and would make the tabloids of today blush with the stories that come out. so it's really quite a bad family. And here on the slide we have the six that were mentioned in the New Testament. So we have Herod's father up here, Antipater, Herod the Great here, and the ones in the pink are the ones that were Herod's. So he became the second one. The first one was Antipater. Second one was Herod the Great, lasted till 4 BC or thereabouts. After him, his throne was broken up into 4, which was called a tetrarch, something or other, because we had tetrarchs after that, which is meaning a ruler over a fourth part. And so the throne was actually broken into 3 parts, but really 4, because Archelaus took over half the kingdom, and Philip the Tetrarch and Antipas took over a quarter of the land each. So Archelaus didn't last very long. He lasted only about 10 years, and he was just as bad as his father, a real tyrant, really bad. And Rome actually got sick of him and what he was doing to the nation of Israel. And so he was taken out of the way, and Pontius Pilate came into power. And that's why when Christ is getting judged later on, there is no Herod in place in Jerusalem, because Pontius Pilate was put in place there. To the north we had Philip and also Antipas. After those ones there, the next lot came along here, the number 4's here, and we have the main one being Herod Agrippa the first. He appears in the early part of Acts up to the end of chapter 12, because in chapter 12 he dies, and he thought he was very God himself, and he dies because he was eaten out of worms at the end of chapter 12. He's the one who was responsible for putting Peter in prison. And then after him, Agrippa II, who is around for most of the rest of Acts. So that's the 6. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 there of the Herods that appear in the Bible. So in verse 20, we've read that Herod has died. And it says there, and the angel appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, "Arise and take the young child and his mother and go into the land of Israel, for they are dead which sought the young child's life." So now we've got 2 Herods taken over. Herod the Great's gone, but these 2 particularly are in place. And so what ends up happening, so verse 21, and he arose and took the young child and his mother and came into the land of Israel. So we can imagine them leaving Egypt and coming back to Israel, but verse 22, when he heard that Archelaus did reign in Judea in the room of his father Herod, he was afraid to go thither, notwithstanding, being warned of God in a dream, he turned aside into the parts of Galilee. And so it was because Archelaus was just as bad as his father, so they skirted past Bethlehem and headed back up to Galilee, to Nazareth, because Antipater, even though he was mentioned by Christ as this fox, doesn't appear to be quite as bad as the others. So we see a lot of action from Joseph as he moves his family around for protection for the Son of God, which really displays a great man of faith as well as action, because he was able to uproot his family each time and have big moves to escape from these despotic rulers. And so we have the beginning of the life of our Lord, this small baby bundle turning into a toddler, whose parents were in fear of this King of the Jews, this false King of the Jews who was still seated at Jerusalem. So this madman and his family had much influence on the surroundings of Jesus, physically, politically, and as the setting for the things that are happening around his life as he grows up. So then we come to consider Herod, perhaps in a little greater light, not because of his family and political intrigues, but because of his building prowess. Because Herod the Great was a great builder. And he had extensive building projects throughout the whole of Israel and beyond its borders. He's known particularly for 5 that we'll have a look at tonight, which is Archaeology here, Masada, Herodium, Jerusalem, and Caesarea. So there are 5 great areas that he had a lot of building work to do. But beyond these 5 things that he did, he also did lots of other work as far as building theatres, synagogues, temples, amphitheatres, hippodromes, and other fortresses throughout all of Israel and throughout the Roman world as well. So the Apostle Paul in his travels would have seen some of the building work of Herod in probably Athens and in Antioch as he travelled around the world. And these building works that Herod did set the backdrop or the stage to the events that happened throughout the whole of the New Testament. So, having a look at them, the first one that we'll have a look at is Archaeology, which is east of the Dead Sea and in the area known today as Jordan. So, if we have a look at that, what we have there is a giant hill like this, Dead Sea in the background there. Archaeology was completely destroyed in 57 BC as a fortress. It was always a fortress, but Herod the Great rebuilt it in 30 BC, and it became his fortress to Arabia and also his winter palace. And so if we imagine this hill with a little bit more on it than what we see there, it included massive walls around the top. It had 390-foot high towers on it. There was a massive palace, there was water cisterns, and it was all in here. So, that's as we get a little bit closer, you can see it's quite a natural spot to have a fortress. The day that we were there, if you're thinking that this from now on, is a thinly veiled slideshow, well, it is. So we're going to have a little tour of the land of Israel and beyond and see the works of Herod. Now, the day we were there, the Queen of Jordan was there, which made it even more special than just seeing it in this state. But these are the ruins that reside on the top of that mountain. And from there you can see in every direction, it's just a pimple that pokes out of the otherwise flat land. And on there was great palaces, towers, and great building works. We're all standing around a spot there and looking down because in here was where John the Baptist was held. Because Herod, it was Herod Antipas, who was actually one of the better Herods, held John the Baptist in this winter palace when he was wanting to get rid of John the Baptist. And we know the story. The story, as it's told in Mark chapter 6, is that when Herod Antipas heard thereof, he said, "It is John whom I beheaded, he is risen from the dead." For Herod himself had sent forth and laid hold of John and bound him in prison for Herodias' sake, his brother Philip's wife, for he had married her. So there's a lot of in-marriage and things happening in their family as well. For John had said unto Herod, "It is not lawful for thee to have thy brother's wife." And so because John had said that, he was placed in that holding spot that we saw. He spent some time there and was later beheaded for his views. So that was one of the Herods, in one of the Herod's great places. Going on the other side of the Dead Sea, a little bit south and a little bit west, we have Masada, which is another great fortress, another great palace as well, and though it's believed that Herod never ever went there. Masada is an amazing place. There it is there, taken from the view, from the air. Again, another place that's a flat top, but even harder to get up to. And there's only one direction that you can get up, and it's up around here, or beyond that little part there. It's called the Snake Path. And so it's 400 metres high, so it's way higher than, it's 3 times higher than the Marcaraeus, and it's very hard to get up to. Up there was great views all around, and especially towards the Dead Sea. There was palaces up there. It's a huge area. It's unbelievable in its size. And even walking around, last time we were there, it was really, really hot, and it was very tiring walking around up there. It's such a great expanse. But a lot of the building work they've been able to resurrect, and that's looking down from the top, and you can see the leftovers of Roman camps down here that were there because Masada was famous for the siege that happened in AD 73, where there was 15,000 soldiers camped below wanting to get into Masada and remove the people that were there, supposedly 960 men, but that may be a little inflated. And so Masada was famous as the part that hung on very long against Roman invasion, when the Romans were actually sick of the Jews and the carrying on that they did. The Romans ended up getting Jewish slaves to build this ramp up through here up to the top, and finally broke through onto the top. So that's a plan view of the top. It's missing a little bit on this side, obviously, but on the northern side is the palace there, and then the rest of it is soldiers' areas for growing things and for training and everything. And so a giant place, and there it is there, looking from one end, and there's the palaces down there, all at that end. Amazing architecture, amazing the way that it could all be built up there and never even be used. And there was an amazing amount of the way that the water was carried and brought into that place. There was great water cisterns there, and this is a little model that demonstrates how that there was a gutter, and so the water that used to flow perhaps only once or twice a year would actually find its way down here and come down these gutters, and they would take it up to the top and put it into the cisterns. So very clever was Herod in the way that he built things, and that's a replica of just the northern end with its palaces right on the end there. And inside of those palaces were fancy baths and wash houses and that, which had underfloor heating. They used to put fires in here which would warm all of this area. This is the floor, and so they would sit up here or wash up here, and it was all heated. The heating also went up the walls but in these terracotta pipes, so it warmed all the walls as well as the floor. Very amazing things for 2,000 years ago that were built, and that's just part of the palace that's left that they've been able to salvage and rebuild. It's interesting that David mentions, and this is one of the quotes here, 1 Samuel 24, David sware unto Saul this is after the incident in the cave of Engedi, where David chops off part of the robe of Saul and then feels a little guilty about that and talks to him. After that incident, David swore unto Saul, and Saul went home, but David and his men gat them up to the hold. Now, it's not quite sure where the hold was, but that word hold is masad in the Hebrew. So it's quite possible that before Herod built all his works up there, that this was a known area that was a fortress at the time that David used to visit. So there's 3 mentions of that where he went to the hold, and it just is there. So it's quite possible that David actually lived there 3 times in his life. The word masad simply means fortress or hold or a secure place. It's interesting as well that in 4 of the Psalms, and Psalm 18 is one of them, I'm sorry that that's cut off of there, it says, Psalm 18 verses 1 and 2 says, I will love thee, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my fortress. And the word fortress is also the word masad. So it's quite possible that David, when he penned those Psalms 4 times, he was thinking of this place, and that our Lord, Yahweh, is, in our minds, should be considered to be as safe and as secure as that place. So it's just an interesting sideline there. Okay, so that's Masada. If we go further north from Masada, up just below Bethlehem and about, I think it's 12 kilometres south of Jerusalem, we have Herodium. And Herodium is not really mentioned in the Bible at all, but Herodium was Herod's favourite place, so that's why I put it in. Herod liked this place. It was very close to Jerusalem. He won a battle here, and after he won the battle, he decided that this is the place that he would make his fortress. And so this was his fortress of choice. This was his home, away from home. When he wasn't in Jerusalem, he would be down here. And so this hill is actually built. So this hill wasn't there before. It was there slightly as a mound, but it certainly wasn't like this. This is a man-made hill that he got built, and he built the fortress up the top. You can vaguely see the shape of it. It had 4 round towers here that were very high. There was a town up there. There was great palace, banqueting rooms, and in here was great water storage. And also it's famous because it had 200 steps from the bottom up to there that were actually inside the hill. And so there it is there, very man-made mountain. And so up the top it looks very similar. All of Herod's building work had the same sort of look. So again, it was quite big. It's bigger than it looks. And there's a picture of 2 of the 3 giant water cisterns that were there to hold water. And picture of the towers, what they did look like. And so here, this little portion here is where the stairs come up. And the stairs, so there's 4... Those stairs, there's 200 of them as it leads to the top. It was also his tomb. His tomb is there as well. So it was a place that he wanted to be remembered. So he died there also. Okay, so moving on then to Caesarea. Caesarea is an amazing place up north on the coast. And Caesarea Maritime, it is, not Caesarea Philippi, so there's 2 Caesareas. And what we have here is an absolutely amazing piece of architecture and building work. So we have here, this is a stadium, an amphitheatre, The palace was in this spot here, and there's pools out here as well, sea pools where they could swim. Hippodrome here. We had the water was pulled from further out through aqueducts, which not quite sure where they come, but somewhere down here. And this section here was originally there, but what Herod wanted to do was he wanted to make a mini Rome, so that when people came from Rome, they came to a harbour that looked exactly the same. And so what he did was he built this great wall out around here, which took quite an engineering feat to actually submerge concrete down and build it up and build it up and build it up till in the end it became this proper harbour with shops and markets and everything all out there, so that when people pulled up it looked exactly like the place that they had left. So going down a little bit, this is more what it looks like. So here's the Hippodrome area here. This is the only part that's left of the spit that was out there, and there's forts on there now. Closer view of the Hippodrome. So it's actually quite large. It's larger than it looked from the air, and so there's all this area up here too. And I should have put a picture. There's a picture. I took a picture of a spot further north where the Apostle Paul would have left and headed off to Rome from. But there's the amphitheatre, some of the fancy work that Herod was able to commission. This is standing on the area that was part of the palace. There's the sea pools that allow the sea to come in, and they could bathe in seawater. So some of the streets and some of the areas that were around Caesarea. That's a toilet. It would have had walls, but yes, you get the message. There's the aqueduct that feeds the area with fresh water from up in the hills, and this is an aerial view of it, and you can actually see the remains of what was it actually came out here and around like that. So it actually became a deep sea harbour in through here, so that went out and around like that. This is all silting up. It never used to be as high as that. So an amazing project that we can't see anything of, and that's a recreation of it there. So you can see that's the silted up area that we see, but there it is out there, and so the ships came in through here and docked. Amazing to think that they did all of that 2,000 years ago. None of it's left because unfortunately Caesarea is on a fault line, so it all ended up sinking into the ocean, unfortunately. But there's things that they can explore down there still today. Caesarea features a lot in Acts. And so in Acts chapter 10, I'm sorry these slides have, I didn't set it for widescreen. So Acts chapter 10 and verse 1 says, there was a certain man in Caesarea called Cornelius of the centurion band. So Cornelius was from Caesarea. Later on in chapter 10, Peter also went to Caesarea from Joppa. In Acts chapter 12, we've already mentioned that Herod Antipas was there, and he died. Peter was also imprisoned up there. Philip the evangelist in Acts 21 went to Caesarea, and sadly Acts 23, 24 and 25 chronicles how the Apostle Paul spent 2 years in Caesarea, and not in a very nice place, in a dungeon there. He was kept in, it's called Herod's Judgment Hall, which was actually not a hall at all, it's a dungeon, it's a prison. He was kept there. He went before Felix at one stage, and Porcius Festus decided to leave Paul bound and left him there. And so basically he was just sitting in a cell at the thought of Festus because he didn't know what to do with him. So there he was in there. In Acts 25, Herod Agrippa II goes to Caesarea and he talks to Paul, and Paul talks to him, and Paul appeals to Caesar at that point. So Acts 25 is the famous line where Herod Agrippa says, "Thou almost persuadest me to be a Christian," which was possibly said with quite a lot of irony rather than genuineness. But that's where the Apostle Paul spent 2 years of his life, down there, which is very sad for us to contemplate, that such a great man, such a fantastic man as the Apostle Paul, could spend so long languishing and not able to do very much down there. So it's a terrible thing. And that's just where it says that he appeals to Caesar, and so it was Festus who said, "If thou hast appealed to Caesar, unto Caesar thou shalt go." So we can see that Herod and his building works and all that platform, that stage of life, of events that was created, became the grounds in which all of those that we love from the New Testament had their life around. And sadly, it was not very good for them. And so if we come down to Jerusalem, probably Herod is known mainly for his work down at Jerusalem, and mainly for his rebuilding of the platform and the refurbishing of the temple. And so there was a great lot of work that he did there. A massive expansion of the Temple Mount is what he was trying to do. So the temple was there. He did a lot of building work on the temple, so there's a lot of huge changes to the temple. But what Herod was mainly about is that he wanted the platform that the temple was on to be seen by everyone when they came up to Jerusalem. So whatever way they came to Jerusalem, they would naturally flow up to the temple, and he wanted that grandeur to be seen. So these walls were massive, and in fact that Temple Mount on top that doesn't look very big is actually really, really large. It's much bigger than you think, and so the Dome of the Rock is around about that same spot there today. And so that's what he achieved. And he achieved this by massive stones, massive building work. A lot of the the southern end has got arches and is built up on arches. So a lot of that platform area is built up and is hollow underneath. A lot of it is built with giant stones, some metres long, hundreds of tonnes of weight, and I'm not really sure how they actually got them in place as well as what they did, because the gaps in them are very minute. So amazing building work that he resided over at that time. Architects were called from Greece and from Rome and from Egypt to help out. A lot of slave labour in those days, but massive building works. And so this is the model that is there, but showing the southern steps, so that this was the way in. So up the steps and in through here and up. This is the marketplace, or what was made the marketplace, and that's the area that Christ was not happy with them selling in that area. That's looking from the southwest. The Wailing Wall is in that sort of area there. So that's the part there. If we just go back you can see that the top of that arch there, the soil is much deeper than it is in this model, but that's what we're looking at right there. So that's where the Wailing Wall is, and this is the area, those porticos, which Christ was annoyed that they were become places of trade. So there we've got the temple up there and the smoke rising. The smoke arose more in AD 70 when the Romans came and flattened it all down. The place was only finished in AD 64, and so AD 66. So it was only finished for 4 years, really, before the Romans came down and got rid of what was there. So what we see today, we see the Dome of the Rock in place of the temple. We see some of the remains of the arches. Inside the Dome of the Rock, we see the rock, which is quite possibly where the ark stood. And looking out from the Dome of the Rock towards the Mount of Olives over here, and we see is where Christ ascended from. And so you can see that Herod achieved what he wanted to achieve, great platform, and from wherever you came, you would be ascending up to that temple. A lot of other building work he did around the place there as well. And of course this set the scene, so when we hear of Christ being at the temple when he was a boy at the age of 12, that's where he was. And later when he's with the changes of the tables, that's where he was as well. And later when he came to stand before Pontius Pilate and before Herod Antipas, he was in that area as well. Not on the Temple Mount, of course, but in one of Herod's palaces. So this is the setting for the life that we see. And of course Jesus said at one stage, Mark 13, and Jesus answering said unto him, Seest thou these great buildings? There shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Then said the Jews, 46 years was this temple in building, and wilt thou rear it up in 3 days? And we know that he spoke about his body at that time, but he was also saying about the walls of the temple. So the building work that happened there was thrown down. So this is the western wall of that platform. Above it, right up, if we can imagine, right up was Herod's temple, and all of that and its walls were thrown down exactly as Christ described. And so there it is there, all of the stones down below, thrown off the walls, and there's a plaque there that actually says, collapsed on the paved street are stones of the western wall of the Temple Mount enclosure. They were hurled down by the soldiers of the Roman legion after the destruction of the temple on the 9th day of the month of the year 70. So Christ's words came true, not one stone shall be left standing of that temple, and there is not one stone left there of that temple anymore. So we've had a rather quick tour of Herod's building work. Herod went fairly quick off the scene. His work is still there today to be seen. He was a great man at that time, but a man that we really have to ask the question, well, was he really so great? Because Jesus too has gone, and like Herod, Jesus too was a great man in history. But unlike Herod, Jesus was renowned for saving lives rather than getting rid of lives. Jesus too was also a great builder, but a builder of lives that are fit for the kingdom age and for getting people to build their houses upon rock rather than sand. So Herod will always stand as one of the most deplorable characters of the New Testament. He was a vicious ruler who cared neither for God nor people. He was a king who issued the death of all the babies in the hope of killing God's son, which was futile because, of course, God was with him. And when God's son died, he had that saying, King of the Jews, above his head. So it was a plan that was destined to fail right from the beginning, because Jesus, unlike Herod, increased in wisdom and stature and in favour with God and man.